I'm going to say, first of all, that I realize that some of you already consider yourselves botanists. Others are extremely knowledgeable but haven't taken that title. But I want to tell you that the dictionary definition of botanist is an expert in or student of the scientific study of plants. So if you're listening to this talk today because you're interested in this subject, I'm going to suggest that you are, in fact, a botanist. And as many of you know, it's a slippery slope from just being an enthusiast to becoming a botanical citizen scientist. And this is a really exciting time to be a citizen scientist with all sorts of everything from georeferencing to other types of contributions that you can do, because many of you are very knowledgeable about the plants that you are associated with. So my goals for this talk really are three to help you further your enjoyment. And I'm going to tell you what may seem an oxymoron. I know I've had friends tell me this, but I really passionately believe that learning how to understand the scientific names is going to further your enjoyment. So it'll make you more skilled, but it'll also just help you enjoy the recognition of plant species. I'm not going to tell you there's not an ivory tower. I've taught plant systematics and botany at a college level, and I know that I've seen the textbooks and they're very complicated, and they're given the perspective of a student who might want to publish new species someday as they become a professional botanist. But there's a whole range of ground in between that ivory tower and your work on the ground with real plants. And I think that's a meadow filled with lots of wildflowers. And so I'm going to help you see how to use those names, even if you're not the one publishing a plant, because I think that's what the vast majority of us do. And I think that knowing how to use those names will inspire you to go out and see more of the green. So I like the phrase, as opposed to plant blindness or green blindness, to actually seeing the green. So the agenda is why use botanical nomenclature, and I'll translate that for you. That phrase just means scientific names. So botanical nomenclature is a fancy way of saying scientific names for plants. And then how to use those names. For example, if you're doing a species list, and then some suggestions on where to learn more, as you need to. So why not just use common names? Well, so first of all, different languages with different alphabets. And so I will tell you that these scientific names in Latin are used by people whose script includes katakana and the Chinese script and Sanskrit and any other alphabet. They stop in the middle of their language and their character set and put the Latin name in. Much, much harder for them, of course, than those of us who speak English or one of the Romance languages. The second major name is the common names are local. And I'm going to give you some examples of that to drive home that point. So the same name is used for species in different places, right? So just because I create a name here locally doesn't mean that someone else doesn't use that same cute common name for a totally different plant because it's theirs. I'll show you an example of that. The other thing is they're not standard. So you've been through this conversation before where what is this one? And you tell them what your local name is. And then someone else says, I call that the whatever. And so there are many names. So you have this database, people would call it a many-to-many relationship. So you have many different names used for the same species and the same name used for many different species. And then also, this is a really important point, many plant species have no common name at all. So there are 386,000 species of vascular plants. And so there just aren't any official common names. And there's no such thing as an official listing of common names. Or there are many simple local lists of common names. So here's a couple examples. These are both from English-speaking places. So I grew up in Northern California, and my father, who was a small-time cattle rancher, knew a common name of his choosing for every plant that he could recognize. He loved recognizing the plants. And these beautiful little, what he called Johnny jump-ups are in Dodecatheon. They're not edible at all, but they are the first wildflower to bloom in the spring in that Mediterranean climate that comes in February. And so people, are the Johnny jump-ups up yet? I found a cookbook on how to use edible flowers, some place I was browsing, And it had a recipe for using Johnny jump ups in a salad. And I thought, that's weird. I didn't think that Johnny jump ups were edible. Well, it turns out that Johnny jump ups in England are viola tricolor. So just those little violas. And you may have used little viola petals in your flowers, and they're pretty and kind of tasty. So the reason for calling them Johnny jump ups is they're the first flower to bloom in the spring. So I will tell you that people get very hooked on their common names. My sister still is annoyed with me if I call this flower anything else because she thinks Dad was right about calling that one Johnny Jump Ups. And she will say, "Do you mean Johnny Jump Ups?" And I'll say, "No, I mean what everyone else calls it." And I know Dad called it Johnny Jump Ups. Here's some of the other names that the local people in Northern California either call it Johnny Jump Ups or shooting stars. And shooting stars is much more common. American cowslip, mosquito bills, mad violets, or sailor caps, right? So you have all of those great common names. In England, other names for the violas are Heart's Ease, either spelled with punctuation or Heart's Delight, Tickle My Fancy, I Like Jack, Jump Up and Kiss Me, it's a little bit longer, Come and Cuddle Me, Three Faces in a Hood, Love and Idleness, or Pink of My John. So many different common names and many names used for the same species. Here's another example. This is an edible thing. So you may have bought yucca root in an American grocery store. It looks something like this. And it would be probably labeled yucca root, Y-U-C-C-A root. So what that is, if you find that in the American grocery store, is the Manihot esculenta in the Euphorbiaceae. Most of the world calls that cassava. And this is an important carbohydrate in the tropics, but only after it's been cooked adequately because it has cyanide. And so everyone in the tropics who grows up with this yucca root as a family staple knows that you don't eat it raw or undercooked. What happened was some of the languages that where this cassava root was eaten called it YUCA. So someone in Europe back before Linnaeus's time corrected the spelling of yucca for cassava to YUCCA because they'd heard of this one. So in the meantime, colonists who had been naming plants of the Americas named the yuccas. So one example is the Joshua tree. If you've been out to the American Southwest desert, you might know the yucca tree. This is a close-up of the flowers, but you can see the yucca tree in the background. Or you may know Adam's needle or bear grass. And again, bear grass is a very well-known common name for a completely different species where I did my work in the lily family. So here's the interesting thing. So the yucca filamentosa actually has edible fruit as long as you get rid of the seeds. In the American Southwest, Native Americans sometimes ate the roots of yucca species. And they don't have cyanide. They're just like a lily bulb, basically. And so to call this one yucca root, if you were to Google this, you could probably find one or more of the silly websites I've seen that try to tell you how to cook this thing. And they show a picture that looks like this, the way the Native Americans cooked yucca. And so just silliness about calling two things the same name. And this probably was just based on a misunderstanding. And some people have thought that actually Linnaeus himself misunderstood and thought these were the same because, people were just still exploring. So the yuccas abusing that name could actually cause some problems. So a couple of days ago, I had a crossword puzzle clue that said Spanish moss or nori. Yeah, I'm a botanist. I should get this one right away. What in the world do those two have in common? So nori is a red algae. And that's the little dark seaweed that you would have wrapped around your sushi, right? Spanish moss is not moss at all. It's Tillandsia eusnoides. It's an angiosperm. And I put a picture of a little tiny flower there. So draping from the trees, you in Florida know this species. I was thinking, but that's got nothing to do with nori. And then it turns out that the answer to the clue was red algae because I got the down answers. And then I remembered that Irish moss, which is a different flowering plant in a completely different family, This is the stuff that people use between stepping stones. It's got little tiny white flowers. And then what was confusing about that is the name Irish moss is also used for this red algae. And this red algae is the source of carrageenan, right? So you have 2 angiosperms and 1 red algae called a moss. And actually, none of these are mosses. The point is, they just remind us of mosses, yes? Now, I'm going to tell you that that's actually not such a problem. I actually have a botanist friend who's long gone now, who suggested that if you're walking up to a plant and you're not sure what it is, but there are other botanists around, that you start out saying, it reminds me of, because then if you're completely wrong, you can say, oh, I know, but it just reminded me of that other species. Yes, it's a great technique. I've used it a couple of times. So here's the thing. You may know the genus Usnea. It's a lichen, right? So lichens are not related to the mosses or the algae. They've just got algae and fungus in layers. And there's this Usnea, or old man's beard, that hangs from trees in some of the forests and other places. And the people who named the species Tillandsia usneoides meant it's the Tillandsia that reminds me of Usnea. And so here we're going to see how this Latin name, Tillandsia usneoides, appropriately uses the reminds me of. So instead of confusing people, and I'm going to stop right here and say that I know that a lot of you work with people who are just beginning. You're taking them places, you're showing them plant names. I'm going to make the point that it does not make botany seem easier to call Spanish moss, and Irish moss. It makes people think that they're not catching on very quickly. It does not help their brains. So that's the seed I'm going to plant with you. You notice you cannot talk at all without using plant analogies. Okay, here's an example. Now I'm going to switch from why you shouldn't just use common names. And I'm going to talk about an example of how powerful it is to use scientific names. So there is one name for each species as a goal, right? Not everyone agrees, and we're still working out some, and we'll talk about name changes later. But the idea is there's one name for each species. It's always in Latin, regardless of the alphabet. So here's an example. I had the opportunity to go to Slovenia once. We had a Slovenian exchange student when my son was in high school, and he lived with us for a year and visited his family. And I was the only botanist there, and they wanted to show us the entire country. And I grabbed this wonderful little tiny guidebook, and it was all in Slovene. And they don't use the Cyrillic alphabet, but the language is related to Russian and Ukrainian. So you notice that this Bodecha Lobodica, but below that, and below this entire Slovene name, there's the name Ruscus aculeatus, and next to Gorska lagarica, there's Fritillaria orientalis. So I was able to catch on very quickly as we rushed by and saw everything in the country, because those Latin names were there. And this is an example of a for the public type of a little publication, but you'll find this in scientific papers as well. So that's an example. And I want to stop and say one thing about respecting local names. So I just did a talk a couple of weeks ago to a group of Hawaiian citizen foresters, citizen scientists. And in Hawaii, there's only one local language. And so it's really important to people to use the Hawaiian name. Where I grew up in Northern California, if you were to choose the Native American name as the common name, which of course would only be recent, because until very recently, unfortunately, all of us ignored the native languages locally. But I'm going to tell you that if you look at the wide distribution across the West Coast, for example, of plants, there would have been many different native languages that would span. And so you would need to know which tribe you were speaking with. And so I'm going to posit that even if you choose to use the native name of the tribe that used that where you are at the moment, that the scientific names are really helpful to translate to other names. Okay, so one of the things that people hate about Latin is that no one knows how to pronounce them. They're long, and some of them are worse than others. I'm going to reiterate what you probably know. There's no official right or wrong way. The Jepson Manual, when it was published a few decades ago in the introduction, suggested that the appropriate reaction if someone corrected your pronunciation was a knowing look, because there is no right or wrong way. They may prefer their way. The best thing to do is simply sound them out and say each syllable in each diphthong. So diphthongs are a pain in the neck, but when we add a family name suffix, and we'll come into this in more detail, it's A-C-E-A-E, which is very intimidating for speakers of any language. What botanists, most of them do, is pronounce ace-e. So you see this as ace, ace-e-e. There's actually two choices for accent, and I'm going to tell you that neither one is officially wrong. The Latin hydrophyllum means water leaf. Hydro, water, you would recognize phylum as leaf. So the two main ways you'll hear people pronounce this is hydrophyllum, because the penultimate syllable, the third from the last, is the accent. And so because of that, you would put that as a soft English O, so hydrophyllum, which maybe sounds sophisticated. The other thing that you'll hear people do a lot is pronounce this as hydrophyllum, which emphasizes water leaf, right? And so I am going to tell you that someone else told me once that the best way to pronounce the Latin is the way your major professor pronounces it, especially if you're taking class for a grade, right? So, whatever communicates fine. There's no right or wrong. And I'm going to tell you that one of the best tools, if you're trying to communicate, especially with different across languages, had the opportunity to go to an International Botanic Congress in China and take a wonderful several-day field trip with some Chinese botanists. And the accents, we had people from all over the world, and the accents would get us in a lot of trouble. And we would say, what is that, while we're trying to take pictures? And they would tell us, and sometimes the name wasn't registering. They would immediately whip out their cell phones and show us the Latin name in writing. And we would say, oh, hydrophyllum, got it, thanks, and go on to the next thing. So even if they're pronouncing this differently, the written is spelled exactly the same. There's a little hint here, and again, I'm sorry, but I studied the pines for my research. And so this kind of came up as a joke in conversation. So you actually should pronounce the vowels, the I as in the long E. So normally you would pronounce in most words, but European speakers want to avoid unfortunate homonyms. So everyone, when they're talking to English speakers, says pinus, not pronouncing it the other way. So again, we call them pine trees, so saying pinus as the genus name makes sense. So Latin is not, it may be a dead language, and but you still can use it. Okay, let's talk about the binomials. So binomial just means two words. And so I want to make sure that you know that each species name is made up of two words. And the first word is a genus, and that's always a noun. And the second word is officially, this is part of the ivory tower. They call this the species epithet. And the reason they call it an epithet is that it's usually an adjective, but it's not always in Latin grammar. And I'm going to tell you that unless you love grammar, you don't need to know any more than that. You simply are going to use them the way they were published, right? If you're not learning to publish and create a new name, you simply need to know that you'll use the two words exactly how they were published. So the way this works is that the International Code of Nomenclature sets the rules, and by agreement with taxonomists, that's all plants, including the algae. And because traditionally mycologists hung out with the botany departments, that also includes the naming for fungus. So those people all get together every 6 years and work out a few things. I'm going to tell you that the animal and bacteria people also use Latin names, but they have slightly different rules, and in fact, a little bit relaxed. And then there are going to be some separate rules that add on top of that for cultivated plants. Now, The International Code of Nomenclature doesn't decide which is the right species name. All it does is there are a set of rules that say that, for example, in the genus Helianthus, because that is the epithet has to agree in gender and number, so masculine, feminine, singular, or plural, with the genus. And so they have a list of rules that say that things like it must agree with this. And then they have rules for duplicated names and some other things. So before we leave this slide, I want to go through the parts. The genus Helianthus is always capitalized, no exceptions, ever. And it's always in italics, no exceptions, ever. So if you have a journalist writing for the public and they don't do that, would you write to them and explain to them how useful it is? Because in a paragraph, it makes it very clear that you are seeing it pop out. Obviously, if you're on a typewriter, you don't need to do that. Actually, if you are actually going back and using an antique typewriter, the right thing to do is underline them. And that used to be an acceptable thing to do. And you'll see that sometimes before typesetting, before word processing. The epithet is not capitalized. And we used to, up until a few decades ago, and you'll still see this done, we used to capitalize proper words. So if the epithet was in honor of a person or a country or a place name, you would see that capitalized. And we have quit doing that. We don't mark it wrong in older texts, but you will not do that now. But it's always in italics. And so the author is the next part here, and it's usually abbreviated. I'm going to go into some more detail in just a moment. We require the author to be there in scientific publications. Otherwise, it's optional. And I'm going to give you my personal opinion that if you're making a species list with present day, the way the duplicated names have been all sorted out for you, I would simply omit the authors. If you are using them, don't put them in italics. So it's italics, italics, not italics. So that's the binomial, always two words. And I'm going to explain to you why it always has to be two words, because the epithet is an adjective, and kind of like blue dress and blue sky, blue doesn't mean anything by itself. It's a modifier, and the same thing is true with annuus. This is the annual sunflower. And so it is just a modifier. I'm going to explain a little bit more how that works. Okay, the plural of genus is genera. So you want to sound literate, you could say I have one genus and of this and three genera of that. I mentioned always capitalized, always in italics. And here's how you abbreviate the genus after the first use. Helianthus annuus and H. divaricatus were present at this site. And notice when you do that, that the correct way to do that is to put the H period, or well, not the period necessarily, but the H in italics also. And if you have two genera that are both starting with H in the same paragraph or the same paper, you would write HEL as your abbreviation and HER as the other one. So that's how you handle genera in writing. The species epithet, you always use it exactly as published. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of interesting things, and I think this is going to help you understand when you bump into names. First of all, I told you already that it was chosen to agree in gender and number with the genus. So gender being masculine, feminine, and number being singular or plural. I already told you it's always italicized and should not be capitalized. Here's what happens. If we, based on new scientific evidence, move the species to a different genus, the epithet moves with it. And when we do that, we change the ending to follow this rule, gender and number. So I told you exactly as published, but it's exactly as published with a modification for grammar. And the important point here is that the epithets don't stand alone. So I told you before, species names are binomials. And so macrophyllum, and it's funny because I say hydrophyllum, but I always say macrophyllum instead of macrophyllum. Maybe my advisor did that. But, and I sometimes say hydrophyllum, it depends on who I'm talking to. It means big leaves compared to others in this genus. So here's a really important point. If a species is published and maybe has just little tiny leaves that are a couple of millimeters long, but those are long compared to others in the genus, it would be called, they might choose the name macrophyllum. Now, when this gets moved to another genus, there could be something in that genus, another species with even bigger leaves. We do not change the epithet. And this is partly out of respect, I suppose, but partly just to help trace names around. So when you find an epithet, macrophyllum, it probably means that it's got pretty big leaves, but it's in relationship to the originally published genus. So it can be really helpful. And I'm going to give you some examples of epithets in a minute. Some of these epithets have been used a lot. I just did a quick count in the database. Gracilis, which means slender, is the winner. 646 species around the world. Angustifolia, which means narrow leaves, in 529 different species, and elegans, which means elegant, in 499. So many of the epithets honor a person or refer to a geographic location. I'm going to just mention the geographic location. What happens is, if upon discovery and publication of a species name, if the botanist thought it was only found in southern Africa, or they might name it Austroafricana, but it may later be discovered to have a much wider distribution, or maybe it's become a weed all over some other part of the world, right? We don't change the epithet. So you can use that as a clue if it's named after a geographic location, but that does not give you the current complete known distribution, but it is a clue. So those are epithets. Let's give some examples. In the book, I gave several pages, and I think the first question I'm going to ask you is, which ones would you already understand? So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds just to look in there and see which epithets you would already have guessed just based on your English background. And actually, if we have anyone with Italian or Spanish, either as a primary or secondary, you're actually way ahead of us, or you had a really good vocabulary that taught you some Latin. Maybe you've taken Latin. I'm going to guess, we don't have a chat going on, but I'm going to guess that you probably have a couple. I'm going to explain a couple of things about how this works. One is, you probably remember from Latin that the A can mean not. So call, C-A-U-L, is stem. So acaulis means stemless. But A in Latin doesn't always, because affinis, that A doesn't, it's part of the word. And I don't think I can give you any Latin grammatical things that help you recognize which those are. But if you recognize a root word, C-A-U-L, like stem, and it's an A, then it means not stemmed. Another thing is that you will start to build these up in your vocabulary. So for example, once you learn that crass means thick, and so we use the word crass in English for lots of, tacky things. Crassifolius is thick-leaved. Crassipes, pes is one version of foot, of ped, of foot. So you will build on these. And in a workshop I'm going to be doing, I've got a bunch of little cards to put face down on the table to see if people can start matching them and narrow down and make an educated guess with a group of people about which is which. Because I think when you're reading species names, when you're trying to key something out, for example, if you find one that's got campanulatus and you've got a flower that has, bell shape, that's great. One thing that's difficult looking at these is sometimes it's not clear if the epithet is capillaris. You may not have a good way to guess whether it's the leaves that are hair-like or the, some other part that's hair-like. So, and which part is keeled. So they were chosen by botanists who were trying to be helpful. A couple more examples. Here's some other Latta latifolius and parviflorus. Let's see, I was going to give you latifolius and millifolius. So lat meaning broad, milla meaning many. Macranthus meaning large flowered, micranthus meaning small flowers. Another thing I'll point out though is that once you learn the root word, nana, it with a feminine genus, nanus with a masculine genus. So they both mean dwarf. And so this is an example of what would happen if something was named nana with a feminine genus and then later got moved into a masculine genus, just grammatically, they would change the epithet from nana to nanus or vice versa. That makes sense? Trying to think of any others that I can. I will say that I know that teaching students, one of them early on figured out that there was a nurse's webpage with a lot of Latin root words that was more useful than anything the botanists had put out. But these are pretty easy to figure out. Okay, so that's a species. So we have a species, and the species was published, and I'm going to tell you how that's done in a little bit here. If there's variation that's observed that's discrete, and the botanist thinks those deserve names because they're useful, they could be named as infraspecific. So in other words, smaller subdivisions. And truthfully, you can do either varieties or subspecies. And what is normally done is if someone in a genus or family starts naming infraspecific as varieties, that's what the next person does, or as subspecies. And there's some where there's dueling varieties and subspecies. There's no magical distinction or nothing in the ICN rules that controls that. It's up to the botanist's presentation. So what this works is there's a type species, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means in a slide or two. So the way you do that when you're writing out the list is you would have Erica calcina, variety fragrance, Erica calcina, variety perplusiflora, and Erica calcina, variety basitiflora, so sticky flowered one. So again, these infraspecific names work like modifiers of the modifiers. So within Erica calcina, variety or Erica calcina, you'd had the fragrant one. I don't know what periplosa means. Around the something or other, I don't know, we can figure that one out, or the sticky flowered one. So what happens was three infraspecific different subdivisions were published. And what that does is leave the rest of them in variety calcina, and that's called the typical variety. So you actually, when you have three named varieties, you have 4 taxa. And the same exact naming works with subspecies. So Atroplex patula subspecies Austroafricana, Atroplex patula subspecies Verusi. See, and I don't know, there's never any good way. If I was with a French audience, someone would probably correct my French because this is in honor of someone with a French name, and how you pronounce that is probably appropriate to your audience. There would be a typical one of Atroplex patula subspecies patula. So notice that the SUBSP is very specific, and I'll show you later with some abbreviations why that is. But you do spell it SUBSP, and that's not italicized, and neither is this, which is a pain in the neck in word processing, but it makes the 3 names pop out of the page at you. I'm going to tell you that if you look up the dictionary definition of taxon, and the plural of that is taxa, it actually means any level in the hierarchy. And so if you're a taxonomist, you're dealing with, plants and then families and genera and species. Those are each levels in the hierarchy. And taxon is appropriate to use for that. But in everyday, especially when we're working at the species level, what people say is a lot of us don't like to say there's these 4 varieties. We don't like to say there's 4 species because it confuses people. They're looking for different species. So what we say is there are 3 taxa, or there are 4 taxa if you're counting there. Does that make sense? So we'd say there are 4 taxa. So the most frequent use of the word taxa is when you're wanting to say different entities, and some of them are named as species and some of them are named as infraspecific. So authors. So a valid publication, we're creating a new species known to science, we would become the author. And the reason for this, there are twofold. So first of all, there were many accidentally duplicated names. So you can imagine back when the only way to communicate was hand typeset printing presses and boats across the ocean, when all the colonists were naming species all over the world, people accidentally created a lot of duplicated names because they didn't know what their colleagues had done elsewhere. And the other thing that did, though, is if you're familiar with scientific writing, we put a citation to a publication in parentheses after a published paper that supports our evidence. And then at the end, we have this literature cited section. Well, if you had to do that with every species name, you would have a much bigger list of literature cited. And so by putting the author name the first time you use the species, it puts the burden onto the reader to at least go know that it was something that was published by Linnaeus or was published by someone else later. So what we do now is most journals, if they're scientific journals, still require the author name the first time it's used. So I'd use it the first paragraph or a table where it was used, and then I would drop it and not keep repeating it because it makes it hard to read. They're not in italics. I am going to tell you that the abbreviations are standardized. And if you're interested in that, there's an organization called IPNI, the International Plant Names Index, I think. And so the L is with the period is always Linnaeus. And I'm going to tell you, oh, yes, this is an important thing. By etiquette, not by the ICN rules, but by etiquette, botanists do not name a plant after themselves. So if you have a species that has a person's name in it, someone else published that species and named it in honor of that person. The one exception is Linnaeus, when he created all of those new species names, named a genus after himself because it was his favorite flower. And he posed with it in a portrait. So his is the only name abbreviated to just one letter. And sometimes they add more to the name. So because there are lots of botanists over the years named Moore. So Harold Emery Moore is H.E. Moore. And the IPNI does this very useful thing. They maintain a list of those author name abbreviations. And the fun thing about that, if you're interested, if you have a species that you care about, is if you go look that up, you can find out who H.E. Moore is, and you have links to what else he published, everything else he published. So if you're just interested in following that trail, that's much easier to do now. So authors and scientific names. And again, if you are making a species list in the present day for people to actually just use, I would recommend just not including the author names. If you're publishing in a scientific paper, you would be asked to do that. A few useful abbreviations. I'm going to just give you the ones I think are most helpful. SP is an abbreviation for species. So if you write or type Quercus sp, means you're unsure which species of oak it is. So Quercus sp. And unfortunately for me, the way to make the word species, which basically is, it's got an S at the end, but it is both singular and plural. The way you make a plural abbreviation of species is SPP. Makes no sense to English speakers whatsoever, but that's the rule in Latin for other types of words as well. So if I were to write or read Quercus spp, I would know that the author meant several species of oak. I don't know which ones they are. Maybe I needed acorns and they weren't present. So I just wrote Quercus spp. And by the way, most botanists pronounce both of these spa. So Quercus spa and Quercus spa among friends. And that is why when you are doing a name, you spell out subspecies, SUBSP period, in the in for specific name. A lot of add-ons had to do with some of the goofy early publications of names. I won't go through with those. If you work with herbarium specimens, you may see an exclamation point with someone who's looked at the specimen and their name, and it just means that they agree with the name that was put on the label. There are some additional details in the book, but I think those are the most useful for most people. Let's talk about hybrids a little bit. So the symbol for a hybrid name is correctly the multiplication sign. So if I'm doing word processing, I can go do insert symbol and choose the multiplication sign. But if you are just typing and don't want to take the time, a lowercase x will be understood. I wanted to back up. I'm sorry. I didn't mention one thing I should. The correct way to do the author names of like H.E. Moore is to leave the spaces out, which looks goofy, but it saves a little bit of printed. I'm not sure why they did it. That actually is the correct way to do it. And you'll see that in publications. And that's the way it's actually written. And the same thing is true of hybrids. So Solanum X amulans, it's a multiplication sign and no space. And you'll see it with a space. No, I don't think anyone cares, or few people care. What happens when it's published with an epithet like amulans is that the author of that species thought it was stable and important and recognizable enough to deserve its own name. It makes it easier to talk about. The other thing is if you have both putative parents, so putative meaning we probably haven't done the genetics or to actually prove that those were the two parents, but it seems like the logical conclusion. So I'm using the term putative. You put them in alphabetical order. So if you have a hybrid that's of Verbascum lignitis and Verbascum nigrum, you would write it like this. And in this case, most of us put the X with a space, or the multiplication sign with a space. That's how hybrids are named. And again, there's not a hard and fast rule in ICN rules about whether to give a hybrid an epithet or not. We're going to talk about how names are published in just a minute here. So family names. So according to ICN rules, you add this really long suffix to the first genus that was published. So Aster, you just add ACE, and you say Asteraceae. For Pinus, it's Pinaceae, and you had to drop the US, but that's okay. Someone else has done that for you. But you just want to be able to recognize Pinaceae as the family that for which Pinus was the first genus published. This has been many decades now. This rule has been in place, but there are still some historically used family names that people loved so much that the ICN rules, those botanists got together and voted that those are still official and correct alternative names. And a couple of these you might recognize. So the new name for the carrot family is Apiaceae, named after Apium. But because the flowers are arranged in umbels of umbels, umbellifery is still in use. And of course, the Ericaceae, named after Erica, that's a really hard name. And there's another similar name family, and it confuses people. So people wanted to conserve the name palmy for the palms. And of course, Asteraceae, a lot of us call them the composites. So compositae is there, and the crucifery because of all of the agricultural, and the same thing for the legumes. So Fabaceae is the correct name for the family, but Leguminosae is another correct name. And Labaceae, because of the lips for the pea flowers. And there are a couple of others that are still legal. These are the ones that Americans would bump into. So how does a species get published? I'm going to give you just a quick example of one new species. This was some colleagues of mine that published a new species in Hawaii called Shidia pentandra. And first of all, under current rules, this is not true back in the 1700s, but under current rules, it had to be a peer-reviewed journal. Sometimes it used to be just a publication, and we've interpreted seed catalogs where horticultural people were taking the seed that was collected in one of the colonies and sold to European botanists. If the name was published in a seed catalog, that was published, right? But in current day, what we do, it has to be a peer-reviewed journal, which just means that it goes, you write a manuscript, they send it to anonymous scientists and get feedback. If the editors think, based on that feedback, that you've made a case, this is unique, and that your name that you've chosen has followed all of the ICN rules, and they publish it, then that is valid publication. So they named it Schedia pentandra. I'll give you just a second to think about that. What do you think pentandra means? 5 fertile stamens, and the others in the whole genus have 10, always 10. They use the abbreviation SPNOV, and that means species novum, which means it's a new species, and you'll only see that abbreviation in the paper that's publishing the species. What they do is give a diagnosis, and under ICN rules now, that can either be in Latin, as this one, or in English now, because what happened was people around the world, even if their language is katakana, they can understand English easier than they can understand Latin. So people have that option of doing either. And so, but the diagnosis here is very short. It just says, how does this differ from other species in this genus? I just wanted to point out, let's see, I'll do it here. A type herbarium specimen is very valuable. When a species is published, the publishing authors point out which herbarium specimen they meant when they published the species. And it can be really important because sometimes there are 2 or 3 at about the same time. And this one was collected by someone else. So the species was published by Wagner and Harris. And this herbarium specimen was collected by Weller and Sakai. There's a whole set of abbreviations for herbaria around the world. So each herbarium has a 2 or 3 or 4 letter abbreviation. And you can look those up and you can find out where that's stored. And those people store those type specimens in very special cabinets to make sure they don't just let anyone handle them. The other thing is the valid publication now requires a line drawing. And in this case, they also included these cool scanning electron micrographs that shows that instead of having 10 stamens, half of them differentially stop developing. And so that's not a requirement. And then what they do is they have a full description, everything about the plant, how the leaves are arranged and all of those things there. So those are the requirements for publishing a new species. And when that's done, the peer reviewers decide if they follow the rules. If they think it's a really insulting name for some reason, they might object, but normally the botanist chooses the name. Okay, so not everyone agrees. So it may be that people agree and just the flora has not been reprinted in several decades. So you may open up a reference book for your state or for a region and find out that the printed version doesn't have the new name. And my suggestion is that if you're doing species list, you just choose a flora, or if you're doing something worldwide, there's a worldwide checklist that Kew Gardens does. This is an important point. In botanical nomenclature, synonym means wrong, right? That's not how we use the word in a thesaurus in English, right? If your synonym means another way to say the same thing. What they mean by that is if you have a list of synonyms, those are validly published names that either violated the rules to begin with because they maybe accidentally duplicated a prior name, or it's been moved to a different genus, or it's not a valid taxon. So someone said, it's really not different. If you grow them in a common garden, they're not dwarfed anymore. They're only dwarfed when they're up on that windy ridge. And so if a name, there's a bazillion, I can't remember the exact number, but if there's 386 accepted, I think the number is huge for synonyms because of things that people got excited about and published in the early days. But importantly, even though they're changing the name, and you are welcome to be annoyed when your favorite thing you just learned, you find out the name has been changed, but There are easy ways to trace to the accepted name, and that is not true with common names, not confidently. Cultivated plant code. So there's actually another set of rules called the nomenclature for cultivated plants. And what it does is it adds. So the rules basically say, follow the ICN rules for the binomial, and then you add something. And what you do is you add a cultivar name, and the word cultivar is a contraction of cultivated variety. Doesn't mean variation, just cultivated variety. And that's always in single apostrophes. There's lots of other things, the groups and grexes and things. I want to tell you that there's no single source that curates the established cultivar names, but some plant groups maintain a registry. So, for example, there's a Rose Society that publishes or maintains either a published or probably a web page now list, and the same thing is true with lots of others. So, Solanum lycopersicum, black brandy wine, or Lycopersicum, black brandy wine. So the cultivar name black brandy wine stayed with this when the Lycopersicum got changed from Lycopersicum to Solanum. So that's how cultivated plant codes work. The book that I wrote doesn't spend much time on that issue because there is a book that's cited there that does give a better presentation of all the copyright rules in different countries and different agreements. So just a very brief how to use the names. One thing I would suggest is you do follow this single apostrophe. So capitalized, italicized, not capitalized, italicized, single apostrophe, and then people will be able to read your list. I want to kind of wrap it up here and just give you a bit of the scientific underpinnings about what are vascular plants. So the vascular plants are all the land plants, and so that includes the mosses and hornworts and liverworts. The land plants includes all of this. The vascular plants are everything above there in the tree. So they had tracheids, so they have woody transport cells, even if they're not woody plants. And another way to say that is all the land plants that are not bryophytes are vascular. So this tree of life, you share a common node, and then we know where things branched out. The reason I want to tell you that is that of the vascular plant taxa accepted, here's the number, 680. There are 386,000 vascular plants. And a vast majority of those are angiosperms, flowering plants. So that's a lot. And that's one of the reasons why, at least using the scientific names, when you're talking to people who the distribution, especially weeds that move around, synonyms are almost double. So a lot of rejected names currently, and so you will bump into those a lot. I want to give you a little bit of philosophy now. The ivory tower has been, I'm not going to say the ivory tower is crumbling, but there are more staircases into it. You probably memorized a kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and Phyta, Ales, ACE, maybe in some kind of high school or college class. The more recent thinking is that we should go ahead and use the name that people recognize, because as we've understood more about how the tree of life actually developed, which nodes to name on that tree and how to do the nested hierarchy changed back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So here's a group called the Angiosperm phylogeny group, and I'm going to reference in the next slide how to find their work. They suggest using the term plantae, which includes the algae, the embryophyta, the land plants, tracheophyta, and spermophyta, the seed plants. And so 3 nested layers in the hierarchy, all using Phyta, because those are 3 terms that people recognize. But then they said everyone knows what an angiosperm is. There's never been any question. So they used that common name, if you will. I will tell you that Asterales, the ALES, the order, can be useful. I'm not going to have time to go into detail in that, but in terms of groupings of flowering plants, that's very helpful and has actually revealed some very interesting secondary chemical information. And then, of course, you'll use the family name a lot. So Angiosperm phylogeny group. The reason I tell you that, you will not be able to read this, but I am going to just tell you that they actually made this beautiful poster. If you have access to a big printer, the last time I tried to do a color poster cash at Kinko's was $100 or something. But if you have access to someone who can do poster size printing in color, this is a beautiful poster, or you can download it as a PDF and zoom in on it. And it emphasizes the orders as a useful category. And one of the things that I wanted to just point out is monocots on this list, because monocots are a clade. They're down, I'm sorry, the monocots are this yellow one right here. So this whole group here is all what you know as monocots. And what that leaves is dicots really don't hang together. There's one branch of the tree up here and some things like the magnolia trees and some other things, and the rest of them are down here. But you'll still find a lot of flora using monocots and dicots, because with 386,000 species, it's helpful to have something to simplify that. So learn to love those Latin names. I realized I told Valerie I was going to say this up front. I used Amazon's print on demand platform because it was easy and free for me to do. I just got a review yesterday that said that he received his copy with half the pages blank. And so working with them, if he asked, apparently they will replace it, but I'm a little concerned about that. But I just want to encourage you, if you have any printed copy with any printing issues at all, I hope you will return it, partly because they need the feedback if their quality control isn't up to standard. So absolutely let them know and let them replace that for you. I want to just close here, running out of time. I just want to say that I think it's important when you're working with people to love them and appreciate their enthusiasm. My husband has a name for azalea, for Rhododendron occidentale, which most of my gardener friends called Western azalea. My husband still calls them, more than 30 years later, those pretty pink flowers we grew by the front door of our house in Reading. He knows exactly what they are. He recognizes them at anyone else's house or the native relatives in the field. But he said, oh, those are related to those pretty pink flowers we grew by the front door of our house in Reading. So I'm just telling you that that works. Native names are important to respect the territory you're in, the language that you're working with, but the scientific names add a way to communicate that is really useful. And I think that the more people you can inspire to not be intimidated by those scientific names, better. So I have some other resources in the book. The World Checklist of Vascular Plants has some ways where you can type in the name. Google is mostly good. You can get lots of things from Wikipedia. And that International Plant Name Index is fun, and you might just enjoy the background on a particular author you like. So with that, I am going to end that and see if Valerie wants to allow any time for any questions. I used up all my time.
Yes, I sure do. People are still on, and we have a number of really good comments. So I'm going to start with the earliest one I received was from Flower White. And I apologize for my audio quality. You probably heard this, Anne, but I knocked over my microphone. And so I'm having to give everybody else this lower quality microphone. So there might be a little more noise, and my apologies. Anyways, Flower White says that she wanted to point out that Latin names are not just Latin as a language, which you discussed a little bit. They're also Greek or Greek derivatives, and she used common persimmon, Diospyros virginiana, as an example, as a Greek name.
Right, that's a really good point. It's so what the rules actually say is you're supposed to Latinize them, meaning you use the Latin grammatical rules for agreement of gender and number. But yes, and in fact, we saw a French name, and you will see other language names included, like in epithets. But yes, a lot of the original Latin names were from Greek. That's right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Jack Jordan says, you brought up the Spanish moss. He says that for English common names of plants containing the word Spanish, moss, daggers, oaks, etc., this makes sense when remembering that most of the southeast United States was once Spanish Florida rather than a reference to Spain itself.
Right. Yes, and I read somewhere that because the Spanish colonizers had long beards and the English didn't, that was kind of, it reminded people of that. And I don't know exactly how that, but yes. Well, and yes, yeah, the U.S. was colonized by lots of different people. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm just scrolling through to make sure I can handle stuff. Suzanne asks, why does Q get to be the utmost authority on current Latin names?
Oh, that's a great question. Q doesn't get to, they just did it. And people either use it or ignore them, right? So botanists are territorial, as is any group of scientists trying to do their own thing. And Q is pretty big. And I happened to choose Q to reference, and I've used it to download for my own databases because I couldn't find anyone else who was doing it. I couldn't find anyone else who took all of the worldwide names. What Q did was they didn't do it themselves. They basically coordinated collaborators. So the plant specialist in the legumes could give their names, and the other person gave their names, and they just assembled it all into this big klutzy Excel table and put a website out. So they didn't actually dictate it. They let each, it was dictated only in the sense that whoever they chose to be the one to specialize in that particular plant group. So yeah, they're acting as a coordinator. And I just found that I couldn't find anyone else who was doing all of it. And it's really frustrating now because you go to a weed, I have things I have a live list of plants. And I tried to add, I used to have the whole California list downloaded in a database. And then I would go to other places. And then got some names I wanted to get on my list because I'd seen in China and I didn't have those. And it just kind of went on from there. And they were the only place I could find that had a kind of a current attempt at curating all of the list. It's a great question. Yeah. Not everyone, if you go to the USDA plants webpage, they do not try to coordinate with Q. No one has time to, they're just not doing it. So, yeah.
And that's the last question for you. Just a lot of kudos and thanks and great presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, if anyone has questions, let me know.
Okay, yeah, if people, you can just email me and I'll connect you with Anne. That works?
That would be perfect. I confess I've got a web page, but I've never gotten it finished because it's just me. So if they want to do that, they can get in touch with me by email. It'll be fine. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, and people want a link to the Zoom. So people, there's a link if people want to get on. So I don't know if you want to join, but I'll send it to you as well.
Okay.
And I guess with that, we'll wrap up, and then I'll hop on this other Zoom if people want to discuss further.
Okay, fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.